She's now at the Center for Strategic International Studies and is widely recognized as one of our greatest experts on India in the United States. Teresita Schaffer.
Thanks so much, Nick. It's lovely to see you again, and my great thanks to the organizers of this conference for including me. As Nick indicated, this is going to be a little bit different from the crossroads of conflict theme that we've been developing since we've been up here. The US has made policy towards Afghanistan and Pakistan, I would say, out of fear of what could go wrong. And we've all seen ample illustrations of some of the things that go wrong. Samina has showed us also some of the things that could go right, but we haven't figured out how to get to those yet. India is a country towards which we make policy largely out of hope. Hope of the great potential if India's current rise is successful, if the overall balance of power relationships in Asia works out, and if the United States properly manages its involvement in both of those things. And so we've got really a very different context for looking at India. What I want to do is to look first very briefly at the transformation of India and of US-India relations over the past 15 years or so. And for those of you who want the longer version of that and the look ahead, I refer you to The Owl and the Turtle, which has been kind enough to stock copies of my book on the subject. Then I'm going to talk about how India looks at first Pakistan, then Afghanistan, and third, the US policy in both of those areas. I'm sure you are aware that India in the past 2 decades has gone through multiple transformations. Its formerly sluggish economy has become one of the world's growth champions. They took a bit of a hit during the global financial crisis, with their 9% growth rate being knocked back to something under 6. They look like being up in the neighborhood of 7 or 8% again this year, and probably back to where they were before by 2011 or 2012. The United States, rather than Russia, has become its most important external partner. Of course, during the Cold War years, there was a very important relationship with Russia, which provided money, cheap arms supply, and very reliable diplomatic support. With the implosion of the Soviet Union, India couldn't get what it previously needed from Russia and began to change its vision of what it needed. And there you go back to the economy again. Economic expansion became not only a hallmark of their domestic situation, but a driver of their foreign policy. And all of this reinforced the tendency to look to Washington as the most important external partner. India's benchmark for assessing its global position has also shifted. During the Cold War, there was a primary focus on Pakistan. Now the benchmark is really, are we gaining on China? The Pakistan issue is still important, and I'm going to get to that. But China is seen as the strategic rival, the country whose status on the international scene India wants to match. And of course, India's military power has also increased, not just through the possession of nuclear weapons, which became official in 1998, but also through a significant expansion in its conventional armaments. India is likely to join the United Nations Security Council as a non-permanent member in about a year. They would very much like to be a permanent member. That, I think, is a whole lot harder task. But India is also a member of the G20, which has now emerged as the premier group for international financial deliberations. They are on their way towards having what one of my Indian friends referred to as a position as member of the board of the world. What I'm going to talk about today is how India's old problems with Pakistan, and I know somebody asked about that last night. I am going to get to that, don't worry. how India's old problems with Pakistan and its emerging position in the world affect its view of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and of how the United States deals with those. And to start by putting them in the context of that last point, I'm going to take your minds back to the visit of Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh to Washington. I'm sure you all heard the story of the gate crashers, but I'm actually not going to talk about that. When Manmohan Singh came to the United States, old subcontinent hands would have been astonished that the word Pakistan barely crossed his lips in public appearances, and then only in response to questions. On the other hand, there was one foreign policy issue that rated a paragraph in every speech he gave, including the ones that were not about foreign policy, and that was Afghanistan. And in another stereotype familiar to Americans, and another departure from the stereotype we're familiar with, Manmohan Singh's basic message was, we want the United States to stick around and to succeed. I always like to start by looking at the map, and what you see here is that India is basically in the middle of its neighbors. This has been a challenge for trying to manage regional relationships, but for our purposes, that isn't a major issue that we're going to look at today. I'm going to start by talking a bit about India and Pakistan, how India looks on Pakistan. And their unresolved problems go back to the start of their independent existence. What you see here is a ceremony that happens every night on the only open land border between India and Pakistan, which is between the cities of Lahore in Pakistan and Amritsar in India. And the fancy dress portion of the border guards do their flag lowering ceremony at the same time with, as you can see, great gusto. For India, Pakistan represents a challenge to their whole idea of being a multicultural secular state. For Pakistan, and particularly, as Ahmed Rashid reminded us, for the Pakistan Army, India represents the eternal enemy, an existential threat. Kashmir is the main unfinished business and is a problem that sticks in the craw of Pakistan and that India would like to consider settled. The problem in Kashmir, abbreviating a great deal, is that this was the one Muslim majority area which did not become part of Pakistan when the British left, partitioning the subcontinent into predominantly Hindu India and definitionally Muslim Pakistan. They fought 2.5 wars that were related to Kashmir. In a formal sense, India takes the position that Kashmir has already acceded to India back in 1948 under the rules then in vogue. That Pakistan takes the position that its future has yet to be decided and needs to be decided by holding a plebiscite. But in reality, the real problem for Pakistan is that Kashmir is, from their perspective, the unfinished business of partition and the part that they've never been able to come to closure on. For India, the problem is that this has led to a half-century of intermittent subversion and violence and unresolved problems with what is now a nuclear-armed neighbor. Increasingly, Pakistan has, for its part of this problem, relied on asymmetric warfare, with the two most recent illustrations of that being the so-called Kargil incident or Kargil War in 1999, which started with Pakistan sending both irregulars and regular troops across the line of control in Kashmir into the high Himalayas, a short, sharp Indian military response, U.S. very effective diplomatic crisis management, and Pakistan's withdrawal. But the other illustration of what I referred to as asymmetric warfare is infiltration of insurgents from Pakistan into India, sometimes with the support of Pakistani official sources, sometimes on their own, and it's always a very ambiguous area. Since 2004, India and Pakistan have, for the most part, maintained a dialogue structure between them, which was intended both to solve some of their, if you will, routine problems, and eventually to work its way towards a resolution of the basic problems between them, including Kashmir. They have also, during that time, maintained a reasonably effective ceasefire. However, what's also happened during that time is widening violence inside India, not just in Kashmir, but in other parts of the country. And the most dramatic and traumatic instance was the attack on the Taj Hotel and a number of other places in Mumbai at Thanksgiving of 2008. I picked this picture so you could see the structure that was attacked. Rather than giving you a whole succession of action photos, I'm going to ask you to cast your mind back to the very dramatic TV coverage of this. There was nothing else going on in the world, and this was all Mumbai all the time for about 3 days. But basically, 10 infiltrators who had come physically from Pakistan held this building and one other 5-star hotel hostage for 3 days until they were eventually brought down. I want to stress how traumatic this has been on India and how it has hardened India's position, not so much on the content of an eventual settlement, but on the process for getting there. And I think we are just at the point of seeing that process turn around. Next Friday, there is supposed to be a meeting between the foreign secretaries of India and Pakistan. It will probably be a disagreeable meeting. It will almost certainly not lead to a breakthrough, but I think it probably will, with a few hiccups, lead to a sustained dialogue process that at least keeps them talking rather than sniping at each other through the press. At the same time, however, there has been growing dysfunction and violence in Pakistan. As Ahmed told us last night, this is from one of the relatively recent bombing incidents in Pakistan. You have 3 successive years in which Pakistan had the sad distinction of record levels of political violence. Indian policy circles, faced with this history in Pakistan and this complex of problems, are torn between 2 schools of thought. On the one hand, let them bleed. If Pakistan is beset by violence, essentially, that's tough. We don't actually want them to fall apart, but let them be under maximum pressure. The second school of thought is, above all, don't let Pakistan's internal order fall apart because the consequences would be worse. This second school of thought has driven policy so far. There is a great deal of speculation that if there were a horrible incident on the scale of the Mumbai attacks in the future, that those who have wanted to avoid military action and avoid dramatic reactions that would basically intensify the extremist Islamic footprint in Pakistan, that they might not be able to hold the line. I'm actually not so sure about that. I think the longer time goes by since Mumbai, the better able cooler heads will be to prevail in Delhi. But this is not a trivial problem. This leads you with the question, does either India or Pakistan want to make peace? Well, my answer is yes, but. They both have just domestic constituencies to deal with. President Zardari, who's looking rather dubious in this picture, has devoted most of his attention since he became president to staying on top of the greasy pole. to avoiding being pushed aside either by his opposition or by the army. He is by no means strong enough to push through a breakthrough with India, particularly since his relationship with the army is somewhat difficult. Now, I should say, going back a few steps, that India and Pakistan, during this long-running dialogue, in the last months of President Musharraf's time in office, came very close to agreeing to the basis for a settlement in Kashmir. They didn't close the gap, but they narrowed it considerably. What neither side had done was to sell those ideas politically. And that's why I take the view that it is the political strength and salesmanship of the leaders in both countries that is the critical ingredient in having a real breakthrough. Zardari, as I said, doesn't begin to have that kind of strength. Manmohan Singh is in better shape politically, but his is not an undivided political leadership, and he took an enormous amount of flack for a rather bland press release that he agreed to after a brief meeting with the Pakistani Prime Minister, not Mr. Zardari, but the other guy, last summer in the Sinai. So he is likely to behave cautiously unless he wants to move ahead. He's going to be cautious unless he has a sense that his opposite number is able to go to town. And to go to town on a settlement which inevitably is going to be much closer to India's idea of what it ought to be than to Pakistan's. Now let's move to the other side of Pakistan and talk about Afghanistan. I can't possibly match Whitney Athoy's wonderful description of Afghanistan ethnically and physically. But just to remind, it's desperately poor. It's been at war for 30 years. The terrain is forbidding, and it is the site of the major U.S. military engagement. The level of U.S. troops, as you can see, has gone up. That was November 2009. That's without the last increment. Afghanistan traditionally has a close relationship with Manmohan Singh. This goes way back. Afghanistan voted against Pakistan's admission to the United Nations back in the 1940s, ostensibly because of the border issue. Actually, this was partly the India thing. You've had a lot of close interlockings there, but there's also been an element of India being friends with the country on the other side of the one it has problems with. That is a dimension which, seen from Islamabad, is a mortal threat. The prevailing view in Pakistan, and again primarily in the military, is that Afghanistan is basically an Indian cat's paw. And the lowliest Indian cafeteria worker is seen as a threat to Pakistan's integrity. One of Pakistan's major objectives in Afghanistan is to minimize India's influence, down to zero if at all possible. One of India's objectives in Afghanistan is not to have Pakistan be the only game in town. This is a problem that has had its violent dimension. The Indian embassy in Kabul has been attacked twice. Afghanistan is also adjacent to two other areas of Indian interest. One is Central Asia, the space just beyond Afghanistan, where a combination of energy resources and a kind of offshore beauty contest with Pakistan engage India's attention, and Iran, the source of 10% of India's oil imports. In 2001, India offered the U.S. anti-terrorism cooperation immediately after 9/11. And at that time, in stark contrast to the way it reacted to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan 20 years earlier, India saw the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan as a way to get rid of the Taliban, who were seen as a creature not just of Pakistan, but of inter-services intelligence, nicknamed ISI, the instrument of Pakistan's use of extremists as a foreign policy tool. India has been involved in Afghanistan. Sorry, I went a little bit too fast there. It is the 8th largest economic aid donor, and if you're looking just at individual countries, it comes in at number 4. That is a significant contribution. I'm not sure that Ahmed's jaundiced comparison between Indian and U.S. aid is entirely fair. But this is something that India looks on as strategically important and that the Afghans want. They don't want Pakistan to be the only game in town. India has also established 4 consulates in Afghanistan, which are looked on with enormous suspicion from Islamabad. They're seen basically as nests of spies. The bottom line is that India wants the U.S. efforts in Afghanistan to succeed. And that was one of the major messages that Manmohan Singh brought to President Obama when he came here in November. They are intensely frustrated that the U.S., for reasons that I think emerge very well from what Ahmed said last night, has welcomed India's economic involvement in Afghanistan, but has not encouraged any involvement on the security side. That's largely in deference to Pakistan's sensibilities. And it creates something of a disconnect between the United States and India, even though our interests are actually fairly well aligned. Now let's look a little bit more closely at how India looks on U.S. policy in these areas. With respect to Pakistan, the United States has largely, and the phrase that's used in India is dehyphenated its policy. Rather than trying to make policy towards India and Pakistan as part of the same package, which involves a series of balancing acts that have become all but impossible. The United States is trying to keep India and Pakistan on their kind of separate tracks. Each has important relationships, but with a very different dynamic. Unfortunately, India and Pakistan have not dehyphenated. They are both more than eager to figure out who is number 1 on the hit parade. India has a major concern that in its problems with Pakistan, especially on terrorism issues, the U.S. will once again pull back from the logical consequences of the Pakistani role that's becoming increasingly clear, whether it be the Pakistani role in Afghanistan or involvement of Pakistanis, including retired intelligence officers, with groups that have sponsored violence in both Kashmir and other parts of India. After Mumbai, the FBI did a little very effective diplomacy by taking a look at the evidence behind who did the Mumbai attack and working that information with both India and Pakistan in ways that actually started to get those 2 countries talking, as they very much needed to, in realistic terms about how to deal with the organizations that lay behind this attack. Unfortunately, they're talking, but they're not saying that much. This is probably not the place, and I don't have the time to go into the complexities of Pakistan's relationship with the Lashkar-e-Taiba organization, which is believed to have been behind the Mumbai attack, but that's where the problem is. The U.S. and India's interests are not far apart in either Pakistan or Afghanistan. In Pakistan, I think both the United States and India, and here I'm talking about India's policy managers, not the security hawks that are mostly outside of government, and not what you would call necessarily the chattering classes. But as far as India's policy managers are concerned, what they want in Pakistan is for the country to stay together, for the state to reassert its authority, and for it to do so in a way that hopefully cuts the legs off of the Islamic extremist groups. I think they recognize that you may not be able to do all those three things at once, but they've got a timetable for accomplishing them, which is considerably faster than any Pakistani strategic leader is willing to contemplate. In Afghanistan, India and the United States both would like to see stability, a move toward more effective government, and not having extremists, particularly extremists with ties to al-Qaeda, as the moving force in that government. In practice, of course, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the U.S. cannot ignore Pakistan's concerns about Afghanistan. Geography and the complicated relationships between Pakistan's military and various counterparts in Afghanistan mean that the United States basically has to put up with a substantial Pakistani role and hope that Pakistan and the U.S. will be able to pursue objectives that are close enough to bring our involvement to a happier state. That leaves me with one final question, and that is one that is frequently asked, which is roughly, does the road to a happier Afghanistan have to lead through Kashmir? This is something that's been asked both rhetorically and non-rhetorically by many people, including leaders in the United States. My short answer is no. I think that the United States needs to be focused on both problems. It has an active role in Afghanistan. It has basically, and is likely to have for some time, a largely passive role in India-Pakistan diplomacy. The most effective period of India-Pakistan diplomacy in the past couple of decades was the year or so before President Musharraf left power and then eventually left office. There were back-channel talks between authorized emissaries on both sides that took place on a fairly regular basis between India and Pakistan. And this was the setting in which, as I mentioned earlier, they managed to narrow quite considerably the gap between their positions when it came to the most neuralgic issue, Kashmir. That is, in my mind, the model of how you can get India-Pakistan diplomacy working again. There is a role for the United States in very quietly and discreetly cheering, suggesting from the sidelines. There is, in my judgment, no useful role for a high-profile diplomatic effort. There is a reason that Richard Holbrooke's mandate does not extend to anything that includes either Kashmir or India. If I were going to name a special envoy, which I actually don't think is a good idea, but even if you did that, the last person I would give that responsibility to is a guy whose primary responsibility is for Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's a way of ensuring that you can't do anything effective with India on this critical issue. In those circumstances, and considering what I just said about the difficulty that both governments would have in actually closing a deal if they came to a breakthrough, I think that for the United States to assume that it has to solve Kashmir before it can be effective in Afghanistan is a counsel of despair. I have a 2.5-year-old granddaughter. I think she will be standing here before you get to that point. I mean, unless you have a major change of minds, but that's not going to happen in the kind of time frame that we're concerned about for Afghanistan. Now, my own view is that we have to become more long-distance runners in Afghanistan, but I think politically we will have to become long-distance runners with fewer troops engaged in order for that to be sustainable in the United States. So, to come back to where we started, we have an expanding relationship with India, which is driven, I think, mostly by a growing convergence of interests between the United States and India. Most of that concerns things I haven't talked about today: the balance of power in Asia, the stability of the Persian Gulf, the texture of global governance. The South Asian neighborhood is the most troublesome part of our relationship with India. Nonetheless, I think it's important to remember as we wrestle with the difficulties in Afghanistan and Pakistan that India is, in some larger sense, a player, that it's a country with an independent and relatively hopeful relationship with the United States, and that at the end of the day, if we play our cards right, one might be able to diminish the animosities within this troubled region and take advantage of the potential for economic, cultural, and educational interaction among them. Thank you.